Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Reach, and today we're here to ask and answer one simple question. How does using GenAI affect our mental capacities? In other words, what are the dangers of over-reliance on GenAI? And that's really what we're focusing on today. Thank you for joining the membership again, Sylvia. That's very much appreciated. So I should probably preface this a little bit by saying I'm a technophile. Now, as English learners, we can break that down. Techno, referring to technology. Phile means liker. So technophile means that I like technology, and actually I love GenAI. I use ChatGPT every day, many times. I use it for all sorts of things, including planning my streams, planning my lessons, including daily life. So ChatGPT is obviously a very useful tool, and I'm not at all coming at this from the position of saying that we shouldn't use GenAI or ChatGPT. I do believe that that would be rather similar to saying in the 17th century that we don't need anything other than candles to light our houses. So that is definitely not where we're going with this. We are accepting that GenAI is here to stay, and it's a very useful tool that we can use for many things. However, I do think it is important, especially for us technophiles, it's important that we do consider the dangers of over-reliance. And this is a topic that I've been researching over the summer. I haven't quite finished yet, so obviously the things that I'm going to say today are rather conditional, although I have been doing a lot of reading on it, and so I have quite a bit to say about it. So I'll just say a quick hello to everyone. Hello there to Sleepwalker. Hello, of course, to Sylvia. Hello, Pachu. Don't worry, we're going to address that. And hello, Lainey Hung. So we all love ChatGPT. And of course, we might well say, well, if calculators didn't make us worse at arithmetic, why are we worried that ChatGPT might make us worse at thinking? Well, I think there's a few things we could say about that. First of all, actually, calculators may well have made us worse at arithmetic. Although it depends how we're measuring that. Are we measuring it as our ability to get from A to B? Or are we measuring it as some kind of mental capacity? You could also think about this in terms of travel. Like, did cars make us worse at traveling? Well, actually, cars enable us to get from A to B quicker and easier. However, if we consider traveling to be some capacity in our physical body, like walking, then perhaps cars did, in fact, make us worse at traveling because, it's much easier to be very unfit and unhealthy and overweight in a world where you have traveling technology such as cars. So you can sort of consider both sides with this. Is it about final product, or are we concerned about our own actual faculties? And I think it's worthwhile us considering both, because of course, in a world where people work with computers constantly, sitting at their desks, traveling in cars, we know that it's even more important to consider that we need to also integrate activities in our lives which allow us to maintain our fitness. This is why people do things like going to the gym, which of course 500 years ago, going to the gym wouldn't have really made sense for 99.9% of the population, because it would have been just a complete waste of energy when you're going to be getting all of the working out and fitness activity you need just in your daily life, and energy was a bit of a scarcity. So if we think about that in terms of ChatGPT, then maybe we need to consider what is the going to the gym version of thinking, for example. And a good place to start with that is interacting with ChatGPT itself, because the factor of over-reliance on ChatGPT, the very interaction and the very nature of the way that over-reliance on ChatGPT might work is something that could indeed lead us down a dark hole. So this is something which has been in the media, and you can see articles such as this. The headline here, if you can't read it, says, "Don't ask what AI can do for us, ask what it's doing to us. Are ChatGPT and co harming human intelligence?" With a sort of skull and crossbones little image there. And there's plenty of thinking like this, and we could call it Luddite thinking and so on and so on. But I do think there is something to it, being that I have done a lot of research on this now. Liam says there's many AI besides ChatGPT. Yeah, but they are all based on the transformer architecture as laid out by... Oh, I had the guy's name in my mind just a second ago, and now it's totally gone. How annoying. I was trying to show off there, and it completely backfired on me. Vidrick? Something like Vidrick, isn't it? I can tell you the name of the paper. It was called Attention is All You Need, and it was first published in 2017. Vaswani al. 2017. Attention is all you need. That's where they laid out the theoretical architecture, the transformer architecture, which is used in pretty much, well, it is used in all of the generative AIs. And that's why they're all kind of similar, although the training differs, and sometimes they have other kind of safety features tagged on, but they're all essentially the same, as far as I can tell, and I've used many of them. You might prefer one or the other for different tasks, but they all have the same basic structure underneath. You know, it's like comparing word processors. It's like, do you use Microsoft Word, or do you use LibreOffice, or whatever you use, you know, Google Docs? They all have a very similar understructure, don't they? All the different word processors. So I talked a little bit about the dangers of ChatGPT, and really what we're talking about here is something called cognitive decline. And I'm basically asking, well, could use of these things lead to cognitive decline? And is that something that we should be worried about? So cognitive decline basically would be us losing elements of our mental faculty because we're not really using them as much as we should. That's exactly the same as, you know, if you stop going to the gym, then your muscles get smaller. So this would be, we can call this atrophy. So atrophy is a word which means that something decreases when you don't use it. And the kind of skills that we should be particularly concerned about with ChatGPT are analysis, memory, and judgment. And there is some indication that this may already be happening just because of Googling and the internet. So, it is less valuable now for someone to be an encyclopedia of knowledge because everyone has in their pocket an electronic encyclopedia called a smartphone that they can use to instantly access whatever information that someone 50 years ago would have had to know and learn and have in their mind. So there is already some indication that that's had an effect. I'm not really as concerned about memory as I am about these other two. They're the ones that I'm going to highlight. So analysis and judgment. And you can see here that we have this term due to offloading. So offloading is sort of like outsourcing. In other words, rather than washing your car yourself, you pay someone else to do it. And that's absolutely fine when it comes to washing your car. But if we're doing that with the kind of things that can lead to atrophy, then what will happen? It's kind of like instead of going to the gym, then you pay someone else to go to the gym for you. Well, what sort of effect is that going to actually have on your health and fitness? So that's one thing that we need to think about. We can also talk a little bit about externalization. So there's two sides to this, because externalization could actually be quite a positive thing. Essentially, the idea there is you are not just considering yourself as a human unit, but you're considering yourself as you plus your tools. So, in other words, someone asks you a question, you Google the answer, you give them the answer, and they say, hey, you didn't actually know that, you just Googled it. And then you say, yeah, so what? I gave you the answer. What does it matter that I just Googled it? And I think that in many cases, that's a fair point. I mean, if someone isn't a particularly good programmer, but they use ChatGPT and they make you a good program, then surely you can just pay the same for it. It's like they've made the product, so that's fine, right? We have a net increase in performance. In other words, the output is better. So who cares if it's just you or if it's you plus the tools? Now, there is something to be concerned, though, with this idea of quick receipts. So that's just simply the idea that rather than having to work and learn certain skills to do something, now we can just offload it and do it instantly. And it's all well and good when you're considering the performance, the net performance, but how about our capability as an individual human and what dangers that might have in the future? So, let's consider something else. We'll consider GPS. So what's GPS? These are global positioning systems. These used to be little devices you have in your car that map out the area and tell you where to go. Most people these days just use their phone as a GPS. There is very real data which shows that GPS technology has had an effect on people. the London cabbie story. So there were studies in the past showing how taxi drivers in London had certain degrees of neural activation and certain improvements in their mind based on the fact that they had to know all of the streets of London and be able to navigate their way around when driving the taxi. And essentially, GPS kills that because you don't need to do that anymore. That was quite a complex mental skill. There's a lot of memory involved, a lot of spatial awareness, knowing the best route, even knowing what times of day certain roads will have a lot of traffic and things like that. And now you just click on the GPS and it takes you where you need to go. And so the spatial memory of these London taxi drivers, of course, is not as good as it was in the past. It used to be exceptional, but now they rely on the tool. And of course, that applies to anyone. So anyone who uses a lot of GPS. And we all use it. I mean, I use it all the time. To the extent where I need to really consciously and deliberately tell myself to focus if I want to actually learn how to get somewhere as a routine without using GPS. I don't know if any of you can relate to this, but sometimes I find myself, if I'm going somewhere new and then I go there several times, that I don't actually know how to get there. I just do what the GPS tells me. And it's only when I deliberately and consciously go, hold on, maybe it would be quite useful if I knew how to do this without the GPS, just in case, that's the point that I actually learn the directions, even if I've made the journey 10 times. Of course, that wasn't the case in the past, but it is now. So there's an example there of the sort of over-reliance that we could have on GPS. So how does that apply to ChatGPT? It says in maps there, we're going to change that to, if GPS shrinks your mental map, what does a ChatGPT do to your reasoning? And we also spoke before about analysis. Analysis and judgment. How will this affect your skills of judgment and analysis? Are you at all letting ChatGPT make decisions for you? And what about analysis? If I asked you to analyze something, would it be your first instinct to go straight to GenAI? Or would you have some idea how to begin that process yourself? Sleepwalker says, as long as our driver brought us to the destination, everything's fine. The problem may begin if the system suddenly stops working. That's one way of looking at it, and that's kind of the externalization that I was talking about before, and I think it's a valid point. And of course, as someone who uses ChatGPT all the time, I'm certainly not discounting that. But what about the effects that we don't necessarily see there? What we have is a whole group of people who used to learn very well and very effectively a certain specialized skill that actually had cognitive benefits for them. You could see it in terms of hippocampus growth in their brain. And now they don't get that. A new taxi driver in London will not go through that experience. So it's not just about them getting the results as a taxi driver. It's about what potentially that effect could have on other areas of their life. And when it comes to GPS, you might not really care so much about that. I mean, do we really need to have great navigational skills in the modern world? Maybe not. But we're not talking about GPS and spatial awareness here. We're talking about something a lot more wide-ranging. ChatGPT doesn't just navigate for you, it can do a lot of things for you. Of course, please do smash that like button as suggested there by Julia. Hit subscribe for more content. To be perfectly honest, Pachu, I don't know the exact location of the hippocampus, but it's somewhere, it's not quite the very center of the brain. It's somewhere kind of in the middle. And I can't really point to it because it's not at the sides. You know, it's like my fingers can't get to the point where the hippocampus is. So it's somewhere kind of here, but like inside your skull. So not on the outside and not right in the middle, somewhere in between. So, moving on, and this is something we haven't even touched on yet, which is the potential problems that GenAI can have. One of those is to do with basically the way the technology works. They are very contextual, and they're becoming much better at rhetorically defending themselves and the information they have, to the point where they can be very convincing. And if you haven't yet experienced someone telling you this is true and you're wrong, and you say, well, how do you know? And they say, well, look, this is what ChatGPT says. There are many anecdotes coming out like this which don't make a lot of sense. For example, someone saying that, and then someone else saying, yes, that might be so, but yesterday NASA said this. They have this reliable source, NASA, and you've got someone else arguing that ChatGPT says that's not the case. We're going to experience that more and more. They call these things hallucinations. Basically, that the chatbot is hallucinating something that's not true. Personally, I don't particularly like that terminology because it sort of indicates that only ChatGPT and generative AI is susceptible to this kind of thing. But of course, as humans, we know that we're very fallible when it comes to the truth. We believe many things which we later find out are not true. And sometimes we believe things which aren't true, find out that they're not true, but continue to believe the things that aren't true and tell people that they're true. So it's not something that's unique to AI, that it just is not a truth-producing machine. I think that's one of the first things that you should be absolutely certain of when you're dealing with generative AI, which is that it's not a truth-producing machine. But of course, you should apply that to anything. Any book, any expert, any information that you get anywhere really in the world, you have to at least assume that there is a percentage, no matter how small, that the information you've received might not be true. So I don't think this is unique to generative AI, but maybe it's just the case that because it's a computer, people are more likely to fall into the trap of believing things just because the AI's told them that it's the case. I personally, because I use the thing so much, I've come up against this many times, and I've actually fallen into the trap where I've done something that ChatGPT's told me, and then I've found out it doesn't work. For example, I had a bit of a problem with fleas recently, and I checked with ChatGPT about the flea treatment that I was using, And ChatGPT assured me that it was very effective. It even did a Google search and provided a couple of sources, just a few random websites telling me how effective that flea treatment was. And so I didn't take any immediate action on that. I just kind of went along with it and went, must just be a few fleas that snuck in. Well, I left it for a week and the problem got a lot worse. I ended up having flea bites all around my ankles, and every time I checked the cats, there was a couple of fleas on them. And so at that point, I took them to the vet. And the vet told me, yeah, we don't recommend using that over-the-counter flea treatment anymore. It's not really effective. And he gave me a prescription flea treatment, gave that to the cats, and within about 10 hours, there were the bodies of dead fleas all over the place. So that's a clear personal experience with how ChatGPT can lead you down the wrong rabbit hole. And even for me, this is me who's now I'm studying this right now, and I'm actually telling you that to be skeptical about the thing, but I fell into it. So I do think you have to be very careful. And they are getting better at confidently convincing people that what they're saying is true. And so you have to be even more prepared to challenge it. That's what I'm trying to tell you here. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the big study reviews which I've been looking at for my research. One of them is Kasnetchi and a group of other people. And they performed a study which basically found that if generative AI is not presented as requiring critical skills, then there is a risk of passivity. In other words, if someone is given generative AI and you don't then instruct them in how to critically examine the output, there is a risk of becoming passively reliant on the chatbot, which is probably why you're getting people now having arguments saying, well, that's not true because ChatGPT says it's not true, which is a really, really, well, it's not a good thing. It kind of reminds me a little bit of when Wikipedia first came out and everyone would say, well, it says this on Wikipedia, and so that can't be true. Of course, these days, culturally, we almost understand that when someone uses Wikipedia as a source, people just kind of shrug it off. They're like, oh, really? Wikipedia is your source? Well, okay then. It's like we've come to an understanding that you can't just use Wikipedia as a source. And I think we do need to get to the point where that is also the case with generative AI. You can't use generative AI as a source. So, Raitsakya and Tikhonova looked into the effect of generative AI on critical thinking. And they basically found that critical thinking would only benefit when, again, the instruction of generative AI was done in a critical context. In other words, you're being taught how to use it in a critical way. But specifically, they spoke about the Socratic method. So the Socratic method is a very ancient method of inquiry, which involves questioning assumptions and basically making a list of questions in order to check how someone has come to the conclusions that they've come to. And essentially they were saying, well, this is one way you can do that with ChatGPT. And if It actually improves your critical thinking. And that's the key point here. It's not all bad news. It's not all, oh no, we might fall into the trap of mental passivity and become sort of people who offload our thinking to the GenAI. But there is actually a potential here, a silver lining, where if we interact with these things under the right conditions, we can actually see benefits. And I'll talk about what those conditions are in a little bit, by the way. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea, maybe some basic instruction about how to apply critical skills, critical engagement, and what I call critical use. That's what my research is about when using these things. And again, Melissa et al., you can check all these studies. If you just do a Google search for that and ChatGPT, Melissa et al., ChatGPT, or GenAI, then you'll find the paper. So improvement was possible when students actively verify and reflect. So again, there's this need to say, well, you need to engage critically. You need to think about verification and reflection. So part of my project, I'm trying to integrate all of these things and create a framework for teaching students about basically how to do this, how to interact with GenAI with this critical framework in such a way that not only will you get truth coming out and you will be able to use the tool in a very effective way, but also you'll have these cognitive benefits. That's the idea. Not going to talk about that right now. This is actually essentially also what Reichsakia and Tikhanova were saying, but basically the idea that if you're engaging in this sort of Socratic dialogue with GenAI, then you can actually see benefits. So let's just think a little bit about what the future might look like, given that GenAI is massively mainstream now. Everyone's using it. It's probably the minority of people who are not using it. So what can the future look like, given that people are using GenAI all the time? So probably the worst case scenario we can call atrophy world. This is the result of overreliance, essentially. So what happens if we go into a world where we're just using GenAI as a second brain? Not even a second brain, we're just using it as a replacement brain. Well, it says here, schoolwork becomes prompt wrangling. In other words, I give you an assignment, you go home and work out the best prompt for your generative AI in order to produce the work. Verification muscles begin to fade. We become not so critical in the way that we think about the world. And discourse bends to model biases. That means that essentially the viewpoints that GPT espouses become the viewpoints that people accept. Of course, there is a danger of that, and there is quite a lot of bias in the chatbots. You can see it quite easily. Just ask it the same question, but swap around the politics in the question, and you can get very different answers. You can get ChatGPT expresses quite a high degree of hostility towards certain politics. You know, I'm thinking of sort of right-wing politics, Donald Trump and so on, compared to kind of more progressive politics. So That's ChatGPT specifically. I'm not quite sure what the Chinese model, what's it called, Deep Blue or something? I'm not sure if that has quite the same perspective, but you do have to watch out for those biases. So this is the world we don't want to go into, isn't it? And this is the good world. We keep our judgment in the loop. This is the lesson from today. This is what we need to do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do that. I want you all to be aware of that, especially those of you who, like me, are technophiles and are using ChatGPT more and more. And I need to tell myself this as well. We need to keep those skills alive, especially when we're interacting with these things. We can use AI in beneficial ways, like as a Socratic sparring partner. This is a great thing to try, by the way. This is a little prompt that you could try. So something like this. Basically, tell ChatGPT something you believe, and then say to ChatGPT, I want to engage in a Socratic dialogue with you. Ask me Socratic questions, and I'll give you answers based on this belief. So something like this. So I'll say, I believe the best way to learn languages is by doing activities you find engaging. Engage in a Socratic dialogue with me on this belief. Ask me questions and I'll answer. Okay, so you can try it, do something like that. And now we're actually using ChatGPT as our trainer to train our critical faculties. ChatGPT becomes our opponent, which is a different kind of frame than we normally have with it, isn't it? A good practice. Try it out. Let me know how it goes. Final possible future, even worse. This idea of basically GenAI gets so good that AI starts to kind of take over our society, or at least the people who control the AI do. And, you know, some people talk about this. Some people say it's a wild conspiracy theory, whatever. It's something we need to consider at least, and worthwhile mentioning that if we engage in this, then this can't happen. So this idea of using critical engagement, using critical skills with generative AI is actually a way of countering these other two dystopian possibilities. So let me talk about some of the specific things that you can do in order to protect yourself from this. This is something I really like, this idea of rackback. So this was proposed in a paper. I want to give you the reference for this. I didn't write it down here for some reason, but I do want to give you the reference for it because all credit to the authors. It was Zhang et al. 2025. They come up with this idea of rackback, which is the idea of basically when you get a response from your GenAI, then you apply this as a sort of verification checklist. So you go through the motions of thinking relevance, accuracy, coverage, bias, authority, and currency. You may have come across something similar to this, by the way, funnily enough, called CRARP, which is a verification model that we used to teach students, and well, still do, I suppose, in verifying their sources when they're writing academically. This is where you check currency, relevancy, authority, accuracy, and and damn it. Purpose. So essentially, we use this little rackback acronym to remind us to check certain things when it comes to GenAI and inquire about them. All of these things GenAI can be susceptible to. For example, this currency was a big one, especially with the older models. GPT-3, for example, would not, in the initial stages, would not acknowledge that Ukraine was at war with Russia, because it was trained on older data and it wasn't checking it. Which, of course, caused quite a bit of consternation with my Ukrainian students. Authority, this is a big one. Authority basically means, what is the reliability of the original source? Now, when GPT gives you an answer, it doesn't always provide sources. Sometimes it does, but a lot of the time it doesn't. And so you have to inquire into that and say, well, where are you getting this from? We need to go to the original point where this has come from so that I can decide where to put that on my measure of trustworthiness. And that's basically what authority is saying. Does this come from a reliable expert? Does this come from someone who's been researching the topic and has published a paper? Or is this like a blog or something, you know? And that was the case with my situation before, where I spoke about the fleas with the cats, where GPT was getting a lot of its information from like these random advertisements on vet websites and blogs and things like that. Well, that's a pretty low level of authority. So I want to know, what do the scientific studies say? And even then, you need to ask questions, by the way. Just because something is a scientific study, I don't think that means you should believe it. You always need to question. And of course, bias. Spoke a little bit about that before. Everyone has bias. It is impossible to be completely neutral. I don't even know what that means, to be completely neutral. Any sort of information has some sort of bias in there. And of course, GPT has its biases, the most obvious being political, as I spoke about before. So Ratback's a very useful verification framework, or at least a framework for a verification cycle. And I haven't actually designed the cycle yet, so unfortunately I can't teach you about that, but you can at least have a go at applying that. This is super fun, and I highly recommend that everyone gives this a go, which is have an argument with GPT and win. I've done this a few times, and I think it's really important for a number of reasons. It can show you how easy it is to convince the AI of another argument. And it can also show you how confidently the GenAI can express something, but then later it will completely flip to the other side if you argue with it. So I definitely think it's worthwhile looking at that. And then bear in mind, of course, that when you interact with GenAI, it's already considering all of this training data that the people who programmed it, they put this training data and then they put this extra training on top of that. It's already considering that stuff. So it's already operating as if it's had a conversation before your conversation. So if you can convince GenAI in a conversation to completely flip on its opinion, then you have to accept the possibility that it's coming to you already flipped. Do you see what I mean? So that's like homework number 2. Make sure you give that a go. If you're feeling a little bit lazy, a slightly less preferable option is to ask GPT to argue against itself. And you can basically just say, well, argue against your own argument. And then you could actually have that argument in another chat window. And you could actually get ChatGPT to apply rackback itself. By the way, while we're on the subject, let me just demonstrate this idea of hallucinations and how GPT can be problematic. This is a conversation with ChatGPT 5, which is the newest model. And you can see here that I said to it, what is rackback for verifying GenAI? And it did a search, and it had no idea what I was talking about. Got to the point where it was saying, are you misremembering it? Maybe you mean rack or back. It's basically saying it doesn't exist. So the thing I just told you about, ChatGPT says it doesn't exist. Julia saying rebut or rebuke. So rebut and rebuke are different, Julia. So rebut basically means that you are giving a counter argument, whereas rebuke is a little bit more than that, because rebuke is like you're saying that someone's done something morally wrong. So rebuke is not just arguing against someone's argument, but it's actually saying what you're doing is bad. Don't do it. Right? So it's a step further. It's almost like telling off when we get to rebuke. So they are different things. So anyway, back to this. You can see it's basically saying it doesn't exist, right? So the thing I just told you about, ChatGPT says doesn't exist, and then I just give it one line. Just said Zhang 2025. And then it said, oh yeah, you're right. And then there it is. Right? So this is a pretty simple example of what I'm talking about. It didn't take much, did it? It didn't take much for this to flip from that doesn't exist to, oh yeah, this thing. And I think it's really important that we're aware of that. This is the latest model. There's no hidden prompts up here. This is the first prompt. Okay. So a little demonstration there. Something worth doing before you ask a question to GPT, ask yourself what you think the answer is. This is just a way of kind of keeping your mental faculties in check. Remember, we're trying to do everything we can just to ensure that we maintain these critical faculties and don't over-rely. And by the way, if you're someone who's listening now and you think that you are not in danger of this and you don't need this, you are exactly the person who needs this. It's the moment that you think that you're not in danger of losing, you're not in danger of this cognitive atrophy. If you're at the point where you think that, then that's where it's most dangerous, and you should immediately consider that in fact you are, and you need to do these things to keep your mind ticking over. Talked about this before. Prompt it for a counter argument, pick one, steel man it. It's a type of Socratic move. So basically just having arguments with ChatGPT. I recommend it. It's good fun. It's great for you. teaches you loads of stuff, teaches you how to argue for one, but it also teaches you how fickle this GenAI can be, and probably always will be, by the way, but we'll see. I might be wrong about that. We'll see, but my understanding from the way the technology works is that it will always have these problems, just as humans do. Always apply rack back and try to triangulate with independent sources. In other words, you can just say to GPT, what's your source? And what it will normally do when you say that is it Googles, which is interesting, isn't it? Because it gives you the information and then you say, what's your source? And then it Googles and says, here's my source. And it's like, well, if that's the case, then why did you need to Google it? Which is exactly what you might say to someone who Googles when you ask them a question, right? But then, of course, you can make your own decisions about at least where the information's coming from. So the overall summary and sort of takeaway from my little lecture today is that GenAI can be your cognitive treadmill or your couch. You choose. Do you want your brain to be sitting on the couch, chomping away on McDonald's and getting unfit? Or do you want to become the Socratic GenAI users of the future, which is exactly the kind of people who are going to have the highest level of employability as well? So this is a very, very useful skill to develop going forward. All right, notes for today can be downloaded from here. It's question time, folks. If you have any questions for me today, then pop those questions into the chat and I will do my very best to answer them. You may ask questions about the material that I've spoke about today. You can ask questions about learning in general. You can ask questions about learning English or just anything that you think that I'll be able to help you with. Disclaimer, I am a language teacher. That is my area of expertise. So I can help you mainly with areas and issues of language, and anything else that I talk about in this stream is my opinion at this moment and may not necessarily be the absolute truth. Just as with GenAI, I am fallible. What do we got? Thank you very much for joining me today. So we got Sway, who says, once upon a time during Modi, Rashmi, car false, AI deepfakes time, our Indians oppose. So a few problems with the English there, Sway, so I can't quite understand what you're saying. But you're talking a little bit about deepfakes. So deepfakes, slightly different, although the technology underlying deepfakes these days actually is also generative AI. I was talking more about the information problem rather than sophisticated video or audio deception, which I think is a slightly different topic. And actually, I'm less concerned about that, and I'll tell you why that is. So, why am I less concerned about deepfakes than just a text interface? Well, the thing about deepfakes is, we're going to get to a point, and I think we're already almost there, where people simply think, when they see a video that's unbelievable, the first thing they think is, this is a deepfake, surely. Is this AI? Right? Like, people are already having that thought. So we're already getting to the point, at least on the internet, maybe general society hasn't caught up yet, but we are getting to a point on the internet where people are already questioning if videos are true or not, even when they are true, which is pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's like the potential future here is actually a future where not so much where people are deceived by deepfakes, but more that people are skeptical about true videos because they think they're deepfakes. So I actually think that's more likely. And of course, it'll get to the point where a video is not really reliable proof, and maybe we're already there. So if you want to sort of show something, then how do you do that with video? Well, You could have a video from different angles, but, you know, generative AI will probably get to the point where it's able to do that quite well. And so where else do we go from there? It really has to be kind of old school testimony. You know, it's like we're going back to hundreds of years ago when you need a certain amount of eyewitnesses, like the hundreds of witnesses who witnessed Jesus's resurrection, for example, 2,000 years ago. Just to give an example, we may well get to the point where eyewitness testimony becomes the kind of reliable source as well. Hello there, Majahid. How are you doing? Patrick says, yes, we trust information on ChatGPT. Yeah, as long as you say that, as long as you're saying that it's something that we do, not necessarily something that we should do. Patrick says, where do we use RackBack? Well, RackBack is a system that you need to apply, Pachu, and I haven't really developed the framework yet. But basically, the first thing to do is actually learn what it means, right? So as we went through it before, it's relevance, accuracy. Oh, we'll do authority first. I can't remember which one first, but we'll do authority. Currency, bias, then accuracy, and then... Damn it, Rich. If I don't know it, then how can I tell the students they need to know it? Coverage. I was going to say context, but I guess coverage and context are slightly different. So basically, for each of these, right, you want to ask a question. Okay? So let's say that you ask something to ChatGPT, Pachu, right? You say, I don't know, anything that you want to know. Like you say, right, my nose is blocked. What should I do? Right? And ChatGPT says, do this, and do this, right? Like, go see a doctor. Probably it always says that when you ask about medical things. It might say, like, I don't know, have a hot shower, spray some salt water up your nose, whatever, right? So then for each, you basically, for that answer, you want to ask a question in each of these areas to yourself first, and then maybe you can consider whether you need to respond and dig deeper on what the chatbot has told you about whatever it is that you've asked. So first of all, is this actually relevant? So basically we're asking, has it got the context correct here? Because sometimes you can ask something, it gives you the wrong context, right? And I've had that before where I ask a question to ChatGPT and it starts telling me something wild. Like I say, like, how do you apply this to this? And then it starts talking about aeroplanes and I was talking about language learning, right? And I'm like, what? So obviously, you know, relevance is kind of one that's usually obvious, but don't assume that it always is obvious, because sometimes context can be very similar and then things can get a little bit confusing. And it's like the GPT is talking about one thing, you're talking about another, and it seems to make sense. And then you suddenly get to a point and think, wait a minute, this thing has completely got the wrong end of the stick. Authority. What's the source? How reliable is that source? Are there multiple sources? What sources argue against this? So this is really the keystone of the way that I think. And, you know, this is kind of a thing that, like, 30 years ago, if someone said the BBC said this, then everyone would go, oh, wow, the BBC said it. Well, it's true. Whereas these days you say the BBC said this and people go, do you have another source for that? Right? Because the trustworthiness of the BBC has absolutely plummeted. In fact, the trustworthiness in media in general is at an all-time low in the UK. I believe it's below 30% now that of people who actually trust the news, which means the vast majority of the country don't trust the news as being true. And why is that? Well, it's all about authority. Authority is a very social term. There's not really an objective way of defining it. We just have to consider, is it credible? Is it based on the scientific method? Is there a study? Has the study been conducted well? You know, it's all that kind of stuff. Very important. Currency basically means, is this up to date or out of date? So are we basing our decision on old information? Like with my flea treatment question before, maybe it was true that in the past, the over-the-counter treatment that I used was effective, but now the fleas have adapted and you can't use that treatment anymore. And that's actually changed within the last 10 years. So in just 10 years, it's made a big difference what the answer to that question should be. So then we have to consider, well, is this information up to date? So is it up to date? Is it out of date? Bias. What is the bias here? What would the other side say? Why is this bias here? Okay. Particularly with GPT, you get a lot of political bias, but also I think I say that because I'm a Westerner and ChatGPT is a Western cultural tool. So if you're from another culture, a non-Western culture, you may well interact with ChatGPT and think, well, a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense to me. And that might just be because of cultural bias, because of course it is trained primarily on Western data. So it has a huge cultural Western bias. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, by the way. Bias is just bias. Might not be bad, it might be good. I mean, for me, it is good. I like Western culture, but, you know, it's worth considering if you're from a different culture that there might be some bias there that you need to be aware of. Accuracy. How precise is this? So it's pretty important, actually, with ChatGPT as well, that you need to get specific because it's essentially predictive, a very, very, very intelligent predictive text. And so if you ask it a very general question, then it could give you one answer. But then if you're a lot more specific, it could give you a different answer. It needs context, you know, just as humans also need context. So we need to consider the precision of the answer. So considering accuracy, like, are all the factors and all the variables being considered here? And does this answer address the center of my point? And coverage. So coverage is just, you know, what could be outside of the training data, what could be outside of this conversation, which might lead to a different solution or a different response. For example, my flea situation again, it just, and the rackback question, that's a good example actually. Like I said, what's rackback? It said rackback doesn't exist. Maybe you spelt it wrong. And then I said, you missed this. And I gave it the study and it said, oh yeah, okay. So that was a clear issue with coverage where the whole picture wasn't there. And even it's interesting, isn't it? Because this is a machine which probably is aware of that study. And even if I open a new chat now and I say, hey, what's this study? It'll probably be able to tell me without even doing a Google search. Shall we check? So I'll say, don't search. Tell me everything you know about Zhang et al. 2025, the GenAI study which talks about rackback. Let's see, does it know? Okay, it's done a search. I don't want to search though. I'm gonna just make that more clear. Do not search the internet in capital letters. No, it doesn't know. But to its credit, it says my last knowledge update was June 2024. So it's impossible that without searching, it's impossible for it to actually know that study. So there you go. We've now highlighted that this is actually an issue of currency, the current training data for GPT-5 only goes to June 2024. And although it can Google more recent information, the core data on which it's trained only goes up to 2024. I didn't actually know that, by the way, so that's quite interesting. I was wondering when because GPT-5 has just come out. It was like 2 weeks ago it came out. There's the chat that I just did. Okay, we've got one of these. There's always a risk of going into the forest. There's always a risk of going into the forest. There's always a risk going into the forest. There's always a risk of going into the forest. There's always a risk to go into the forest. There's always a risk to go into the forest. I think in conversation, Dan, you could definitely say any of those. 1 and 2 sound the most common. 1 sounds the most common overall, and I would say that 2 is a reduced participle clause, where we're saying there is always a risk when you go into the forest. So basically 2 is like a reduced participle clause. And 1, there's always a risk of going into the forest. There's always a risk. You see, when you say there's a risk of, you're actually talking about the consequences. So it's like there's a risk of dying, right? Or there's a risk of the plane crashing. So there's a risk of going into the forest would be kind of like, I don't know, like you're roller skating on the road, and, well, there's always a risk of falling over and going into the forest. You know what I mean? So whereas number 2 sounds like you're saying that if you go into the forest, then, you know, there's a risk. So that, like, there's always a risk when you go into the forest. So 1 and 2 actually have different meanings. 3 sounds a bit weird. There's always a risk to go into the forest. Yeah, 2 is the meaning of there's always a risk. There's always a risk to go into the forest. There's always a risk to... Yeah, 3 I think is the meaning of 1, but 3 sounds the most weird and unusual and probably not strictly correct. Hope that helps. Water testing is done here. Water testing is... can I say testing water is done here? Oh. Water testing is done here. Testing water is done here. Yeah, you can say water testing or testing water. Although I would encourage you to find out the most common collocation in that context, as with anything. But either of them make sense and sound correct. And when you're asking what it is, well, it's a noun phrase in the form of a gerund. Mujahid says, have you done a training course on journalism? Yeah. Why do you ask? I did do a training course on journalism. I would have passed the test if I'd prepared well a year ago. Rich, in the third conditional, can we use past perfect plus a go? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Perfectly fine. Yeah, it's natural. It's good. It's not better to use the previous year. You wouldn't say the previous year anyway. You'd say last year. Just last year. If I had prepared well last year. By the way, another option is to say I would have passed the test a year ago if I prepared well. And actually, I kind of prefer that position myself. Your one isn't wrong, but maybe the other one sounds a little bit more natural. Say I would have passed the test a year ago. Or I would have passed the test last year. They're both fine. They're both fine. Can I say to number 2 in another way, such as going into the forest is always a risk? Yeah. There's always a risk when going into the forest. Yeah, I would say going into here because it's a forest. But it's not impossible to say go to the forest. It's just when you say that, it's like you're saying travel to a location with a forest rather than actually saying that you're going to go into the trees. No, it goes fine. Any other questions? Right, okay, so everybody do remember, of course, to smash that like button. Super important. Smash, 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 smash. If you haven't smashed that like button yet, what are you doing with your life? The only way that I'm going to be doing these streams regularly is if we get a bit of a boost, especially now because I'm just going to be super, super busy now. But I do enjoy streaming, so I want to try and keep it up weekly. We're going to get those big numbers. So smash that like button, comment on the video, let everyone know that this is the place to come. If you are an advanced, particularly advanced learners of English who like to hear about these topics and like to have the full engagement of a language learning professional who's prepared to answer your questions. Yes, I fully intend to carry on streaming, Sylvia. That's the plan. That is the plan. But, you know, it's just going to be that little bit harder to dedicate time in a rare part of my free time doing something which does take quite a bit of effort, but that I do enjoy. So let's see. All right. All right. Thank you very much for joining me today, everybody. Have a lovely weekend, lovely rest of your week. I'll see you next time.